Thank you to the Stats Methods Group and Cochrane for inviting me to present this. I feel somewhat of a fraud. I'm no statistician, but I have done lots of work thinking about how we set up our review questions, particularly with the idea of making sure we have very well-structured synthesis. So Sophia's already introduced the topic today, and I just would like to just begin by really acknowledging the co-authors of mine on the Cochrane Handbook, in particular Joe McKenzie, who led a number of the chapters that the content we talk about tonight derives from, and also my co-authors on the InSynQ tool, which I'll introduce tonight as well, or this morning or today for some of you. Co-leads on that tool are Joe McKenzie and Miranda Cumston. So the work that I'm talking about tonight very much is a collaborative effort, Cochrane-wide. A brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to really start with what is a recap probably for most people on this webinar, thinking about how we go about planning our PICO, the population, the interventions, the comparisons and the outcomes we consider in our reviews. And I really want to think initially just about the eligibility criteria for a review. And so we'll touch on that very briefly. Then I'm going to present some slides just making sure you're aware of the guidance and tools that we have available for planning your questions and preparing for synthesis. In particular, I'll talk about Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Review of Intervention, chapters 2, 3 and 9. And I'll talk about the InSynQ tool, which I've already mentioned. Then I want to pose a question about why we should go about planning our PICO questions and criteria for each synthesis, because many people have thought an awful lot about planning their criteria for their review, but they don't necessarily think in such detail about exactly which studies will be eligible for each of their syntheses. So I want to think a little bit about that. I've got quite a few slides tonight to introduce you to the InSynQ tool, and here we're going to have a bit of interaction. We'll do a few polls to think about how you might use this tool to plan and report your synthesis questions, so a very practical tool to help guide you through that process. And I'm going to finish by talking about the framework for synthesis, which is in chapter 9 of the Cochrane Handbook. It's a nice place to finish because it's a nice segue into the subsequent sessions that will be offered by the Stats Methods Group, because the final step, of course, is the process by which you conduct your actual quantitative synthesis. So we'll finish with that and then hand over to Sophia, who will lead question time. So please be thinking about the questions you'd like to ask as we go along, and we should have a good amount of time at the end to talk through some of those questions. So as I said, I'm going to start by talking about planning the PICO eligibility criteria for a systematic review. And I think probably the majority of people on the call are familiar with this process. They've thought about it. They may have applied the process in one or many more reviews. So this is really primarily a recap, just to make sure we're all thinking in a similar way, but also starting to think about some of the complexities that arise when we've got reviews that are quite broad. So PICO, of course, is the acronym that most people are familiar with. It stands for the populations, the interventions, the comparators and comparisons, and the outcomes that we consider in a systematic review. If we were to take an example, and this is one that I'll carry through the presentation today, this particular example is thinking about exercise interventions for people with hip, knee, or hip and knee osteoarthritis. And so we can use the PICO criteria to specify our question for the review. If that review were to include people with hip, knee, or hip and knee osteoarthritis, exercise interventions, we might be comparing to no exercise or different types of exercise. And we might specify a range of outcomes, let's say pain, physical and psychosocial functioning, quality of life, and adverse events. We can express this as a review topic or a question that includes all PICO components. So our question might read something like this. For people with osteoarthritis of the hip or knee, what is the effect of exercise compared to no exercise or a different type of exercise on pain, physical and psychosocial functioning and quality of life? And so we've structured in this question a question that covers all aspects of our PICO criteria. Of course, there's much more that we need to do than that, and that comes about when we start to specify our eligibility criteria for the review. So what I want to do here, and this is really to get you in the mode of thinking about this, because as I said, this is an example we'll carry through in this presentation. Think about what kinds of interventions you would include. So in this case, what kinds of exercise interventions would you include? And I've got a word cloud set up so you can, if you will, scan this QR code and start to enter whatever you might think might be suitable for inclusion in a systematic review of exercise interventions for arthritis. So whatever ideas come to mind, just pop them in the word cloud and we'll have a look and see what ideas people come up with. So you can see there's lots of different things appearing, things like swimming, yoga, walking, obviously popular with people, but a whole range of other things. Very early on, I put in any exercise because, of course, we might go with something as broad as that. There are things that we could group together as potentially similar kinds of exercise, but a lot of diversity coming through. And that really is the key here, that when we start to think about a review, even potentially as simple as one on exercise, there is a great diversity of interventions that we can potentially think of. And of course, when we're doing a review, we've always got to have our crystal ball in mind, thinking about how will the trialists deal with these kinds of interventions that we're going to consider, and how will we make sense of what the trialists are going to describe their interventions as, and how they might have included different components in their intervention. So I'm going to now flick back to my slides. That was really just to give you a bit of a warm-up, a bit of a chance to think about the topic at hand, because it's one of the most complex things we actually deal with in our reviews, and it's one in which we often forget about it once we define those initial eligibility criteria for our review. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the different guidance and tools we have to help plan our review criteria. And I'm thinking here not just about the review criteria, but the criteria within to help us conduct our synthesis. First up is Chapter 2, which is really there to help you set the scope and give you some ideas about how to go about planning the very broad question that you might have in your review, who to involve in that planning process, and what kinds of tools like logic models and so forth you might use to help you do that planning. Chapter 3 really starts to build on the detail of that and provides guidance on how to go about specifying your PICO eligibility criteria for including studies in the review. And that's what we've initially been thinking about there in that example, thinking about exercise for osteoarthritis. Once we move past that, we might really start to think about the kinds of tools that we can use to do that. And so in the handbook chapter, we talk about potentially using the Tidier framework, which really provides a very good basis for thinking about how you can conceptualize different types of interventions and the kinds of aspects of interventions that might vary across studies and that you might need to think about in order to plan what's included in your review and how you will handle those different interventions. So things like the intervention rationale, the theory, the goal, the materials and procedures that are used, who's providing the intervention, and a whole lot of other attributes such as the intensity, the frequency, where the intervention's delivered and so forth. The handbook also covers information about how to go about planning your outcomes for the review, and indeed it covers all aspects of our PICO criteria, but today's presentation, I'm mainly focusing on two of these, primarily on interventions and outcomes. So if we're thinking about the outcomes, we need to think about what outcome domains we're going to measure. We might use things like core outcome sets, outcome taxonomies, or outcomes from other reviews to help us make our decisions around what outcomes to include. We need to think about how those outcomes are measured or the measurement method. So it may be a kind of scale that something's measured on. There may be a range of other measures. Often those measures will differ quite a lot across studies. And finally, we need to think about the time points or the time frame in which an outcome is measured. And all of these things are critical for clearly defining the outcome domains of interest in our review. The step that I really want to focus on tonight, though, is really the process of planning the PICO for each synthesis. And this is something which was addressed for the first time in Chapter 3 of the Cochrane Handbook when it was updated back in 2019. Thinking about planning the PICO for each synthesis, we're really thinking when we tackle a review like the one we've just talked about with exercise, how do we go about handling that diversity of interventions within the review? How are we going to deal with that in our synthesis? What intervention groups might we specify? What are the comparisons of interest for our analyses? And how are we going to group our outcomes, particularly if we have a diversity of outcomes, a diversity of ways in which they're measured or timeframes in which they're measured? So Chapter 3 really starts to introduce some of these concepts around the PICO for each synthesis. And that feeds into the process of planning the methods that you use to synthesize and structure your summary of results. Some work that was done to try to expand on this, because we realise that this is something that people find somewhat challenging, is the InSynQ tool. So the InSynQ tool is a checklist and guide for helping people develop and report the questions they address in their reviews, particularly thinking about how do you plan those questions for the synthesis that you'll conduct, not just for determining the eligibility of studies in a review. Chapter 9 then is what we used to call the hidden work in systematic review. So it's really thinking about what happens at review stage once you have your studies. Many people are very familiar with the process of summarising the characteristics of studies in what used to be very lengthy tables in Cochrane reviews, and they jump very quickly to wanting to do their meta-analyses. But in between that is a process of really summarising your study characteristics at the level of each analysis and preparing for your synthesis. And Chapter 9 is really all about talking about the kind of behind-the-scenes work that gets done that historically wasn't written about much in the methods of people's protocols. One of the key contributions in Chapter 9 is what we call the framework for synthesis. And the framework for synthesis covers that first step, that process of planning your PICO for each of your synthesis, planning your review synthesis methods, but also those steps that I've just mentioned, the process of examining the PICO of each of your included studies to decide which of your studies are eligible for each synthesis, and examining the study data to see which of your planned synthesis methods that you can actually apply. It finishes with the steps that will be the subject of subsequent webinars in this series, which is obviously to conduct the synthesis. And the InSynQ tool comes in at the end of that process when you're reporting your review to write up your review, because at that point, it's really important that we're very, very clear about the questions that each of our syntheses address so that the readers can very easily navigate the findings of our review. And that's something that sometimes gets omitted. People leave their question specification just at the very broad level and only specify the eligibility criteria for the review, and they don't spell out the specific synthesis questions that were addressed. So InSynQ is designed to help both with the planning or the development of your synthesis questions, but also the reporting of those questions. So I'd like to think a little bit more about why we think people should plan their PICO questions and criteria for each synthesis. Particularly at protocol stage, people find this a little overwhelming. So what we have encouraged people to do is to at least, at a minimum, try to report this information in their final review, be thinking about how they can plan this as well as possible, acknowledging that there's a few things that are often very hard to anticipate in a review. But nonetheless, it is really important to be clear about these criteria and questions we're addressing in the synthesis. So if we return to the example that we started with, which was the example about exercise for hip and knee osteoarthritis, we look at the included studies. Once we start to look at those studies, we realise that that diversity of interventions that you initially identified indeed is a reality when we get our studies. So we have things like supervised fitness walking, strength training, aqua aerobics, tai chi, yoga, more general things that might be called patient education or supervised exercise programs that might include a range of different components. In addition, these interventions are delivered in different ways to groups, to individuals. They're unsupervised and supervised by health professionals, and including physiotherapists and other professionals. They might be of different durations and intensities. They're all forms of exercise. They are all eligible for our review. Stating our eligibility criteria alone is not enough to identify how these different types of exercise might be handled in our synthesis. Similarly, if we were to think about the outcomes, the studies we know report diverse outcomes. So, for example, we have things like pain intensity overall, pain on walking. We have many different aspects of physical function, such as gait, walking speed, and so on. Similarly, many different aspects of psychosocial function. We have different measures of all of these outcomes, so 7 different scales for overall physical function, 5 for psychosocial functioning. The measures are taken at different times, some over a couple of weeks, some over several months. Again, they are all eligible outcomes for our synthesis, but we need to make some decisions about how we're going to handle them. And ideally, we need to preempt some of those things, but at a minimum, we need to explain to people how we approached our synthesis in our final report. So will we combine all aspects of physical function, for example? Will we combine all measures? Or will we report them separately in different analyses? Will we consider only the longest follow-up, or will we specify particular timeframes of interest? All of these things are possible. When we have diverse interventions, such as for this particular review, we really want to think about what our synthesis questions are. And so all of those questions I've just proposed can be encompassed in our PICO for synthesis, for each synthesis. What might that PICO for each synthesis look like? Well, perhaps we have one very broad question. What is the effect of any type of exercise on each of our outcomes? So any of our studies, no matter what form of exercise they examine, might go into the one meta-analysis. Providing they measure the outcome of interest, we'll put them all in the same analysis. Alternatively, we might be interested in more specific types of exercise. So we might be interested in the effects of walking, the effects of strength training, or the effects of Tai Chi, in which case we might undertake separate syntheses for each of these. Alternatively, we might decide to group our interventions quite differently from how they were conceived in the original study. So rather than be thinking about walking or swimming or Tai Chi, we might decide to categorise the interventions in studies according to whether they're aerobic or non-aerobic exercise, and we might then group for our synthesis according to that. And bear in mind that we'll replicate each of those syntheses for each of our outcomes, and we will have had to make similar decisions around how we're going to handle those outcomes. The really critical thing in these 3 examples that compare and contrast the way in which we may organise those studies about exercise in this particular review is that each of our analyses answers a question. Each of those questions can be defined by PICO criteria, but it's actually very uncommon to see questions reported in a review in this way. It tends to be that the questions are specified at the level of the review as a whole, and the detailed criteria that helped people determine which studies were eligible for each of their analyses are not reported. And that happens even in the final review when you've made your decisions, and so it should actually be possible to tell people what decisions you made and how you made those decisions. So we like to think about this as being analogous to the way we organise books in a bookshelf. So a systematic review, in fact, is very much like a bookshelf. There are many different ways to organise the studies for synthesis within a review. If we compare it to a bookshelf, there are many ways we can organise books on a bookshelf. For example, we could do it by colour if we were very visually minded. We could do it by topic. And if we do it by topic, we can use an agreed system like the Dewey Decimal System, or a system that's of our own creation. And we very commonly see people create their own systems for organising their interventions or outcomes within reviews. But equally, we have agreed systems such as intervention and outcome taxonomies to help us do this. But I think one of the things that sometimes we worry about in reviews is that people use a system that's evolved as they added each book or each study to their review. And that's okay, but it's not a very planned method. And of course, when we're thinking about reviews, we're always risking introducing bias when we make decisions that weren't planned at the outset of our review. So while the idea of using an evolving system might be appealing because it is quite a lot of work to try to plan for this at the outset, it may not be the best approach. What we do know for sure is that if we don't use a system to organise books in a bookshelf, we will end up in a mess. It will be very hard to find things, and it may be impossible for others to find what they're looking for. And the same applies in a systematic review. The more organised we can be in terms of thinking about the structure of our review, the more useful the synthesis, the easier it will be to follow. So I want to follow on from that by thinking about the InSynQ tool and how you might use it to develop and report your synthesis questions. We know this process isn't very straightforward. It often requires a lot of content knowledge, which many people bring to the review, but there are often some aspects where we need to involve multiple team members to really kind of come up with a good way of designing our synthesis questions. And the other aspect of it is that we know that anticipating what you might find in the studies is difficult. It often requires a fair bit of work. So this tool is really about helping you address the kind of challenges you might face in developing and reporting your synthesis questions. So I've shown this slide once already, but just so that you've got the code, if you'd like to go and have a look at the tool in more detail. The tool itself has 11 questions. The first 9 apply to both protocol and review stage, and the other 2 apply at review only. They include things like asking you to specify the population and intervention groups you'll use in your synthesis, your outcome groups, and to provide a rationale for all those groups, to identify how you use the groups in the synthesis. So, for example, it's very often that people will specify groups for the comparisons they'll make in their meta-analyses, but sometimes they're not always explicit that that's how they're going to use their groups. They'll list off a number of types of exercise, for example, in their background, perhaps in the eligibility criteria for the review, but they're not explicit that those groups will actually appear in their meta-analyses. Question 5 asks you to specify the pairwise comparison, and those 2 items fit nicely together because if you are specifying your pairwise comparisons, it becomes clear how you'll use the intervention groups in those comparisons in your review. Question 6 is about aligning your objectives with the questions addressed in the synthesis, and that might seem self-evident, and in fact the placement of it at item 6 might seem somewhat strange. But in fact, what we're asking of people there is to do a bit of a sense check. Once you've done your review, make sure that the objectives that you specified at the outset really are what you've addressed in your review, and that it's very clear from your objectives what your questions were. Questions, item 7 is about methodological groups. So, for example, if you're exploring the impact of risk of bias, this is about helping you specify the groups that you'll use for those kinds of analyses. Question 8 is asking you to talk about how you might have involved patients, the public, and other interest holders when you developed your questions. Question 9 really relates to the content of Chapter 9 that I'll talk about, and that's about thinking about the process you use to decide which studies belong in each analysis. And question 10 and 11 are really those items for reporting once you've completed your review, so identifying any changes that you might have made to what you had planned. And again, another sense check to make sure that you report your results in accordance with the groups that you had planned. So don't impose a different structure on your review from the one that you might have specified in your questions. For each of the items, there is an elaboration, and that elaboration comes in the form of what we call essential and additional elements, and it's really to provide some prompts on what to report for each item. There are also examples in the tool, so you can go and have a look at those examples to see what this looks like in practice. what I thought I might do, just to give you a flavour of the tool, I don't have time to talk through all 11 items, and it might not be the most illuminating way to get you across this tool. So I thought I might pick a couple of examples, and I'll start thinking about that first item about how you go about specifying your population and intervention groups to be used in the synthesis. And the way I'm going to do this is by putting up a couple of options. They take the form of a quiz question. The first question I'll pose, I'll actually provide the answer to without getting you to complete the quiz, but then I'll show you a similar kind of question and get you to actually respond to a poll that Dario put up for us. So really what this does is give you an opportunity to see different ways in which people report this information and to try to identify what you think is the most complete way of reporting the information. And it's very common that in the examples I give that we have actually picked common ways of reporting, things that might be quite familiar to you. So thinking about how you might report your intervention groups, I've got 3 examples here, and what I'd like to think about is which of the following provides the most complete information for deciding which intervention group a study might belong in. So imagine that you've specified what in one of these 3 ways, the way in which you'll handle different interventions in your review, and you need to then make a decision around allocating each of your studies to an intervention group once you have those studies. So in option A, the reviewers might have said something like this: we will include all interventions for motor rehabilitation following below-the-knee amputations. These may include motor imagery, virtual environments, and so on. Option B is a table in which those interventions are listed down the right-hand side, the left-hand side, and down the right-hand side is a more detailed definition or a set of criteria that helps define each type of intervention. Option C says we will include any intervention for motor rehabilitation following below-the-knee amputations. Now, all 3 of these things are things we commonly see in reviews when people specify what kinds of interventions they will include. And not uncommonly, we don't see more information than is provided in A and C. We think that option B provides the most complete example and would allow people to actually allocate the interventions from the studies that they have into their analyses. So why do we think that? Each group is clearly labelled, which actually sets up the review very nicely to be able to use those labels throughout the review. But most importantly, the groups are defined in enough detail to replicate decisions around which intervention groups each study is eligible for. And that's really critical information, because what we're trying to do is provide enough information so that someone else could come along and have a reasonable chance of being able to repeat your analysis. Without this level of detail, if we only list the types of interventions without criteria to identify each of the interventions, then we reduce the chance that someone could repeat what we've done when we set up our analyses. A nice feature of this is that the authors have chosen to present this information in a table, which means that the text is very concise, but also it's very well structured. So it's actually very easy to follow for a reader. And it's also very clear that what they're doing is setting up to allocate interventions for a synthesis rather than just provide background information. Options A and C are very common, but they actually don't provide the detail needed to replicate the decisions around which intervention group each study is eligible for. So while they might be sufficient for determining eligibility for the review, they aren't going to allow you to allocate your studies to your synthesis unless you already know quite a bit about those interventions. So they're not likely to be replicable. Okay. I want to provide a second example, which is to think about how we go about specifying our outcome groups. So the thinking is very similar. And this time round, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to the quiz questions. So it will look very similar to what we did before, but this time focusing on outcomes. So I'll give you a moment to read through this. I'll just introduce it. You'll have a chance to read each of the options, decide on which one you think is the clearest, and then Dario will put up the poll for you to respond to. So which of these options do you think best describes how the authors will handle health behaviour outcomes in their synthesis? So what the authors have said is that the primary outcome of their review are health behaviours, physical health, well-being, and so on. Health behaviours include alcohol consumption, blood and organ donation, breastfeeding, dietary changes, and so on. So if this is how the outcomes are described in the review, which of these options do you think best describes the information you have? Can you, first of all, not tell how the authors will handle the outcomes in their review because there simply isn't enough information? That's option A. Do you think that the authors perhaps are going to do separate measure analyses for each of the listed health behaviours? So a separate measure analysis looking at the outcome of alcohol consumption, a separate analysis looking at the outcome of smoking, and so forth? Or do you think what they're planning to do is option C, a measure analysis stratified by the listed health behaviours, with perhaps an estimate for each health behaviour and an overall effect estimate? Perhaps you think they're planning to do option C, present a single meta-analysis, including any study that measures any health behaviour outcome. So which option of those four do you think best describes how the authors will handle health behaviour outcomes in their synthesis? Is it A, B, C, or D? I'll give you a minute to think about that. And Dario's popped up the poll. Thank you, Dario. There's no right or wrong answer here because, in fact, the authors have done something here that is very similar to what we see in many reviews. What we're interested to know is how confident you are about what they will do in their synthesis. So we have a bit of a spread. We've got about 24 people of 134 who thought they couldn't tell because the description was missing information. A few less people thought there might be a separate meta-analysis for each of the listed health behaviours. The majority of people thought they would end up with a stratified meta-analysis by the health behaviours with an estimate for each behaviour and an overall effect estimate. And only a handful of people thought there would be a single meta-analysis with any measure of health behaviour in it. I have to confess that when I read the protocol for this review the first time around, I actually picked option D. I thought that was what they were going to do. In fact, I think they did option B, not option C. I could be misquoting. But what I would say is now I actually agree with the people who picked option A. I don't think from this we can be completely confident about what they will do in their meta-analysis. So just to think about this a little bit more, the recommendations for reporting your outcomes are very similar to those for labelling and defining your intervention and population groups, very similar expectations, but some additional things here. As I mentioned, when we think about outcomes, we think about measurement methods. We also think about the time frame of reporting, and so they are additional features for reporting your outcomes. Here, this is a very typical way of reporting outcomes that we might see in the protocol for a review. A list of outcomes is provided without specifying exactly the level at which the outcomes would be grouped for synthesis. And from this information alone, it's not totally clear how the outcomes will be grouped for synthesis or what might be reported in a summary of findings table, for example. As it turns out in this particular review, the authors are clear about what they do further into the review, and so we don't want to judge them too harshly. But the takeaway from this is really that it's really quite critical as you're specifying your outcomes to be really clear about how you're going to handle those outcomes in the synthesis and how that will flow through to things like your summary of findings table. Okay, the last ones I wanted to finish with relate to the specification of the comparisons. So again, I'm going to put up an example, which I'll talk through and then give you one in a quiz question. So in this particular example, we're interested in what the clearest statement of the comparisons is. So which of these three provides the clearest statement of the comparisons? And again, this is something that we commonly see as the types of reporting. These are all examples of the types of reporting we might see. So in option A, the authors have listed the different interventions that they're interested in and said that they'll make comparisons of these. Option B provides a list where they actually specify each of the comparisons, and these codes here are actually taken from the table that I showed you in the first example. So these are all different types of motor rehabilitation interventions for below knee amputations. And here they've gone through and listed each type and told you exactly what it would be compared to. And there are 5 different comparisons that they plan to make. Some might think that option A and B are equally clear, so that's a possibility. In our view, we think the clearest way of reporting comparisons is to do something like has been done in option B, and I think we're increasingly seeing this approach taken in Cochrane reviews. Historically, it would be more common that people would list interventions and what they were going to compare them to without actually stating the comparison. A versus B is how I sometimes refer to that. In addition to having this list, remember the authors also provided that very nice table where they defined each of their interventions. So in totality, that information really provides a very clear steer as to how they're going to set up their synthesis and how they make their decisions around which interventions belong in each analysis. Okay, so here's an example, something similar, but this one a bit more complicated for you to have a go at. And again, I'll get Dario to put up a poll once we've had a chance to read through. So which option, A to D, most completely describes the information the authors have reported? And this is what they've reported. Again, it's using our exercise example. So it says we will include any type of exercise and lists a whole range of different exercises. And we will include the following comparisons and assume that here they've got a detailed description of the outcomes that they're going to consider. So the comparisons are any aerobic exercise versus an inactive intervention, any non-aerobic exercise versus an inactive intervention, and any aerobic exercise versus non-aerobic. So 3 main comparisons. So do you think looking at these that the authors have provided enough information to decide which studies belong in each meta-analysis? Or B, the intervention groups to be used in their synthesis and the role in the synthesis is provided, but perhaps not the comparisons? Option C, they've reported the pairwise comparisons that they will use to compare intervention groups, or option D, they've reported the intervention groups to be used for comparisons, but not the comparisons themselves. So 4 different options there. Which of them do you think most completely describes the information that the authors have reported? It's not super easy, this one. And in fact, there's not necessarily one clear answer. Just to give you a bit of a hint. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond to that. The point of the polls is really to give you a few examples to kind of latch on to start to think about how you go about reporting this, and perhaps to kind of examine some of the reporting you're currently doing and thinking, how clear am I being in reporting my comparisons, the different groups I'll use in my synthesis and so forth. Perhaps you've got an editorial role and you're wanting to think about how clearly authors are reporting this. Okay, Dario, I might get to you to end the poll there and just to share it. Okay, so unsurprisingly, given the complexity of this, there are a few different responses. So some people think there's enough information to decide which studies belong in each meta-analysis. Others think that we've got information about the intervention groups to be used and their role in the synthesis. The majority of people are thinking that we have the pairwise comparisons that will be made between the intervention groups, but perhaps not as much information as we might need to decide exactly what studies belong in each meta-analysis. And a couple of people think that the intervention groups to be used for comparisons are reported, but not the comparisons themselves. We did this in a Cochrane workshop at the colloquium one year, and this was a very controversial example. People had quite different views on it. Arguably, the authors here have reported the comparisons. This is a made-up example, shall I tell you, so no judgment. The comparisons are stated. We've got aerobic exercise versus an inactive intervention. So by specifying these comparisons, the authors would be meeting the requirements of item 5 in InSynQ, but they're also meeting the requirements of item 4, which is to say what role these particular groups will have in the synthesis. So we think that those two requirements are met. Arguably, there's enough information to decide which studies belong in each meta-analysis. It's not as detailed as the example I gave you for the motor rehabilitation interventions for below-knee amputation. There's not the definitions provided here. But if you think the groups are defined in enough detail, then perhaps you think you could allocate the studies to meta-analysis based on this information alone. Importantly, this item about identifying the role of groups in the synthesis is important for the purpose of comparisons, but it's also important if you're going to do subgroup analyses, sensitivity analyses, and so on. It may even be important if you just want to use a particular way of grouping to structure the text in your review. So this example covers off both those items about the pairwise comparisons and the role of groups in the synthesis. So it's quite a nice example to think about both of those things. So I guess arguably we could say option A applies, but I think option B and C are equally appropriate. I probably wouldn't pick option D because I think we can clearly say that the authors have specified the comparisons in this particular case. So that just gives you a flavour of InSynQ. We've covered off 4 items here. Obviously, there's a number of other items covered in the tool in more detail. So I'd like to finish by quickly going through some of the guidance related to the framework for synthesis that you can use to summarise studies and prepare for your synthesis. So as I said, this is really covering what we might think of as a bit of a black box, a part of the review process that doesn't often go described in much detail. That step from when people have their studies to when they conduct their quantitative synthesis, how do they wrangle with those studies to figure out which studies belong in each synthesis? Chapter 9 really covers an aspect of synthesis that we haven't historically talked about as much as the quantitative synthesis. So in the chapter, synthesis is defined as a process of bringing together data from a set of included studies with the aim of drawing conclusions about a body of evidence. We're very clear to say that this includes the synthesis of study characteristics as well as potentially a statistical synthesis of study findings. So we've talked already quite a bit about this step at the protocol stage, the process of planning the PICO for each synthesis. At this point, once we have our studies, we're thinking about the PICO of each included study, examining them to determine which of those synthesis questions we've set up each study is eligible for. And then there's a step of examining the quantitative data to confirm which planned synthesis methods can be applied and conducting the synthesis. And here I'm really going to focus primarily on this particular step. And to expand on that, there's a number of different steps to talk you through. So first of all, the process of summarising characteristics of each study. Very familiar, the characteristics of included studies tables in Cochrane reviews are well known and sometimes disliked by some for the amount of detail they contain. It really is a familiar step to go through the process of summarising the characteristics of each included study to most systematic review authors. But the Chapter 9 includes some suggestions, and the two main ones really, the first one being the most important, is to standardise the terminology across studies. Instead of reverting just to the way in which the PICO characteristics are described in the individual studies, we suggest using labels and terminology from your PICO for synthesis, and this helps overcome very terminology, compare your synthesis PICO to the PICO of studies, and helps compare across studies. And the other point is to use a tool like the Tidier checklist. So there's an example here, really imagining a study with a review with 102 studies, each one with a description of the intervention. Very hard to make sense of, but if we were to compare the PICO to each study to the PICO for our synthesis, we apply the label that we've specified for each of our intervention groups. We can categorise each of these interventions according to our pre-specified intervention groups. So then we have a way of standardising the name of each intervention and its main components. We can then use that to determine which studies are eligible for each comparison, and we provide an example of a high-level summary of PICO characteristics. So here, the main components of each intervention are coded. The table's ordered by the comparator. These main intervention components are listed and colour-coded in this case to allow easy comparison across the studies. Similarly, the outcomes are all coded by the outcome domains that we'd specified. The tools are listed. The timeframes are standardised according to the timeframes of interest for our review. And all of this allows easy comparison to determine which studies are eligible for each synthesis. We can then look at the data available from each of those studies, and this is something which will be expanded upon in coming sessions, so I won't talk about it now. And from that very broad overview table, we can determine if any modifications to our planned synthesis or comparisons might be required. So, for example, that step might reveal that there are important variations in the intervention that we hadn't thought of, or perhaps we might have very few studies or sparse data. And ideally, we will plan for that sparsity of data ahead of time, but that process can sometimes reveal things we hadn't thought of, might require a small change to our planned comparisons and possibly to our protocol. And of course, as always, we would report that if we had any changes with a rationale. The final step in that process is to synthesize the characteristics of studies contributing to each comparison. And this is something which historically we haven't done so much. So again, in reviews, we're often been very good at providing a detailed description of all of the studies, the PICO characteristics of all of our studies, sometimes extending to many pages in a review. And this is great for describing and mapping the characteristics of the available evidence or what research has been done. But it can sometimes not be the most helpful approach if we're trying to interpret individual findings. And if you think back to the changes we've made with risk of bias, where once upon a time we would put every table into a plot like this, every study into a plot like this, and all of our risk of bias assessments would be presented together, we've now moved to presenting the risk of bias assessments against the studies in a forest plot. And this is really ideal for interpretation. It allows us to apply this information in our grade assessment to interpret the results much more easily. The same thinking applies when we're thinking about the characteristics of our studies, our PICO characteristics contributing to each analysis. So synthesizing the characteristics at the level of each synthesis is important for interpreting results. And there are a number of things that you might focus on when you're doing that, really thinking about how directly the evidence applies to your question, and if there's any important diversity in the characteristics, particularly thinking about things that you'd pre-specified as effect modifiers. One of the suggestions we have there is really to use tabulation as much as possible because it provides a concise and structured summary, much more so than in the text, particularly if you have a lot of studies. The final step in the framework for synthesis is one I'm not going to talk about. It's the performance of the quantitative synthesis, and of course that is the subject of the upcoming webinars.